One Calvinist apologist, Dr. James White, comments on Isaiah 10 saying, quote, "In one passage we have God's holy intention of judging his people through the means of Assyria. Yet, God holds Assyria accountable for her sinful attitudes in being so used. God judges them on the basis of their intentions. And since they come against Israel with a haughty attitude that does not recognize God's power and authority, they too are judged. This is compatibilism with clarity. God uses the sinful actions of the Assyrians for the good purpose of judging his people."
Now, I'm just going to stop for a moment. If God intended to judge Israel when he judged Israel, not 100 years earlier, not 100 years later, could he have done so in Leighton Flower's world? How could God have judged Israel at the time he desires to judge Israel to bring about prophetic fulfillment if God is dependent upon the evil actions of men that are not a part of his decree? Because remember, the whole point of the provisionist perspective is, yes, the Assyrian actions are evil. No, God had nothing to do with bringing them about. Nothing at all. He just uses them when he happens to see them. So where they come from? They only come from the evil heart of the Assyrians. Therefore, they cannot be part of the decree, and therefore God's actions in time in judging Israel are dependent upon his being able to find somebody to use to judge Israel. And so he cannot do this upon a timetable. He cannot accomplish things at a particular point in time. How else I'd like to have an answer to that. How else could it be? How else could it be?
Yet he judges the Assyrians for their sinful intentions. God's action in his sovereignty is perfectly compatible with the responsible and culpable actions of sinful men.
Amen.
End quote. Provisionists like myself would agree that God used the evil intentions of the Assyrians to bring judgment on Israel. However, we do not believe that God, quote, sovereignly brought about those evil intentions. Thus, our view does not bring God's holiness into question or create issues with the concept of divine culpability.
Okay, now, you say that God used the evil intentions of the Assyrians, but he didn't do so sovereignly. He did so because he's looking around and he wants to punish Israel for its sin, but he needs to find some way of doing it. And he can only do it when mankind allows him to do it by having somebody like the Assyrians come along that he can then entice into attacking Israel, because that's what he's going to say later on. So the punishment of Israel has to wait for the opportune time for God to find somebody to do it. That's what we're being told. Yes, I know this utterly means prophecy cannot happen. This is why open theists are the only consistent Arminians. And that is why I think if the Baptist Faith and Message had not specifically made open theism a no-no for Southern Baptists, I think that's exactly where Leighton would be. I really do. It would fit much better. But there he is. So, thus our view does not bring God's holiness into question. Why does my view bring God's holiness into question? Well, because you're saying that God decreed evil actions. Yes, that's exactly what Acts chapter 4 says. That's a straight up statement. No question about it. But that does not mean that his holiness is in question, because he does not put a gun behind someone who's innocent and say, do bad things. And it's only by insisting upon, well, it has to be one way or the other. God has to operate only in the strictures that I can understand as a temporal being. Therefore, there cannot be compatibilism. There cannot be the reality of the divine decree and human responsibility at the same time, because it's too big for the parameters I will allow God to exist in. That's the provisionalist argument. That God's too big. Too complicated for me, therefore he must not exist. or create issues with the concept of divine culpability. Well, you have issues with divine culpability. Again, if you affirm, which I don't think you want to, but you have to, affirm that God knew exactly what the result of all of his creation was going to be, you've got the exact same issues. It's even worse. Because God knew that all this evil was going to exist. He had no purpose for it and had no control over it. None whatsoever. There's some divine culpability for you.
But one of you may say, surely Calvinists do not really teach that God sovereignly brings about every evil intention.
Every.
Do they?
Every.
Has God predetermined every tiny detail in the universe, such as dust particles in the air? And then I should add here, including all our besetting sins.
Yes.
In contrast, Provisionism teaches that God allows or permits creation to act freely, as opposed to being causally determined by a divine, all-encompassing, meticulous decree.
So God has no decree, but he has perfect knowledge of what takes place. What does take place arises out of the creation, unguided by God. Unguided by God. So there is no, again, no logical way that I've ever heard to say, yes, God has exhaustive knowledge of all future events, but there's no divine decree. There's no way around the resultant idea that actions arise in and of themselves, they are purposeless, but God brought it about when he created, because he knew that was going to, before he created, he knew that was going to be the end result. You see, the open theist goes, oh, no, he didn't. And so they can get around the culpability part. The person who tries to hold on to, yes, he did, know exactly what the result was going to be, is left going, so why should we glorify him for how it turned out? Because he's not the one that directed it there. Well, he nudged it. Every nudging involves the violation of free will, right? Well, you know.
And at times, God, being all-knowing, can and will use men's evil intentions to bring about his good purposes.
See what's on the screen? Let's think about it. Let's think about what it means. And at times, not of his choosing, being all-knowing, passively so, can and will, when he has to, use men's evil intentions to bring about his good purposes and plans, which are now made dependent upon what is provided to him to work with by the actions of free men. That's the rest of it that doesn't get expressed. He can't have purposes and plans in and of himself. Oh, no, he can't. How could he? How could it have been God's eternal purpose to judge this generation of Israel that was judged by the Assyrians? How could he do that? Because he's dependent upon the evil intentions of the Assyrians, which do not arise from a divine decree. Now, I would argue that means he could not have known them anyways. But that's another issue. The point is, this position limits God's purposes and plans, his good purposes and plans, to what is provided to him by the creature. It's a huge cost for this stuff. Man-centered theology costs us not only a sovereign God, but a coherent God.
God's wrath is often depicted in Scripture as God's permitting the natural consequences of moral evil, which is not a problem in a worldview where the moral evil is brought to pass by someone other than God.
Now, did you catch that? Brought to pass by someone other than God. So again, what this demands is that you cannot have primary and secondary causes, which is what Isaiah 10 is all about. You have primary and secondary causes in the Assyrians coming against Israel. And in the intention of the one, holiness and goodness. In the intention of the other, sin, judgment is brought about. That's the whole point. But when you a priori say that isn't possible, then you've got to turn the whole story around. You got to turn it on its head. So instead of God acting sovereignly, wielding the axe of Isaiah 10, now you've got the provisionist where the axe is wielding God. upside down. It can sound real good, especially when it's got music behind it.
God's wrath can literally be described as God separating himself from us so that we experience the natural consequences of our own free moral actions.
Really? Okay, there are times when the natural consequences of our sin are an expression of God's wrath. Most of the plagues were not that. Most of the plagues were not that. So there are times when God's wrath is very much present, and it's very much the expression of his just anger. So like, hailstones and stuff like that. That's generally a good example where it's not just God separating himself from us.
That is precisely what we see happening in Isaiah chapter 10.
So are you hearing this? Isaiah 10:15, God is wielding the axe. But they didn't read Isaiah 10:15. They stopped before Isaiah 10:15. Why? Because the way around it to de-Calvinize it, that is, twist it into something it never ever said, the way around that is to make the Assyrians the source. And God is simply using what the Assyrians provide to him. See how this works? It sounds great. It's the exact opposite of what Isaiah was communicating. It's completely false, but it sounds great. And if you want to believe it, you'll find a way to believe it.
Instead of protecting Israel from Assyria, which he promised to do if they remained obedient, God removes his hand of protection and permits the Assyrians to follow their own libertarianly free will.
So, that axe swung itself. It was permitted to swing itself. Yeah, it was permitted. Because it wanted to. I mean, that axe had been trying to go for that tree for a long time. And it was permitted freely because it has libertarianly free will. That's what Isaiah is about.
God does not cause or bring about the evil intentions of the Assyrians. So he is perfectly...
Could he have suppressed the evil intentions of the Assyrians? I mean, it's their libertarianly free will to have evil intentions. So could God have kept them from doing that? Because that's what he'd have to be doing to fulfill his promise to keep Israel safe from its enemies, right? So he has to be able to do that, right? Oh.
To judge them for their rebellious action, despite the fact that God used their rebellion to accomplish divine judgment on Israel for their own disobedience. The fact that God may have incited the already rebellious Assyrians to consider the already rebellious Israelites to be their next victims.
Did you catch that? The fact that God may have incited, that's as close as you can get to wielding the axe and having a purpose, is to incite the already rebellious Assyrians. I don't remember. Did I miss incite? I didn't. I'll have to go back and check the Hebrew on that. I don't remember that. Yeah, so God may have incited the already rebellious Assyrians. We don't substantiate that anywhere, but he may have. Yeah, it's possible.
Does not negate the Israelite and Assyrian people's individual responsibility in becoming rebellious to begin with.
Yeah, part of the question is, why would both of them be rebellious? Maybe it has something to do with their relationship to Adam. Oh, can't have that. Can't have that. But again, just think, folks. All of this to say that God's judgment of Israel in Isaiah chapter 10, in that particular historical incident, was completely dependent upon the provision of the opportunity made by the Assyrians and the Israelites. God could not have done it at that time any other way. All came from them. All came from them. A lot of ramifications for that.
Would Calvinists have us believe that God, quote, sovereignly brought about the disobedience of the Israelites and the Assyrians so as to use the Assyrians' disobedient actions to judge the Israelites' disobedient actions?
Much better would be, would Calvinists have us believe that apart from God's grace, mankind will live in constant rebellion? Yeah. God doesn't have to create rebellion. God does have to create obedience and submission because of the fall. Because in Christianity, there is really a fall. Not like in Manichaeism and all this, that there's no fall there, but there is a fall in Christianity. And the result impacts everyone. And God is regularly suppressing man's evil so as to accomplish his own purpose and his decree. There is no such thing as libertarianly free will, except for God.
What would be the point in that? We do affirm that God may use the free rebellious actions of some to bring about the discipline or judgment of others.
Which means he cannot discipline or judge others unless given the opportunity by the rebellion of autonomous, libertarianly free creatures. Right? I'm not trying to make this up, right? That seems to be what you're saying. God's just doing the best he can with what he's given. All right, just as long as everybody knows what's being said.
But we vehemently reject the notion that our thrice holy God brings about the rebellion of morally sinful creatures.
Even though he created, knowing it was going to happen, he has no purpose in it. And it actually arises from something outside of himself. Just let's lay all of it outside.
According to James chapter 1, he does not even tempt men to do evil, much less sovereignly and unchangeably determine that they will.
Is that what James was talking about? Or is he talking to human beings about blaming God for their own following of their own intentions? That'd be like the Assyrian king blaming God that he was arrogant in thinking that he was the one who had submitted all those cities. Well, that's your fault. No, God does not accept that kind of an argument because God does not reveal to us what his purposes are. The creature cannot make appeal to knowledge that was not his. God, the judge, knows the hearts, and that's the basis upon which he judges. So that's not even what James is talking about. James does talk about the Father of lights and all good gifts and everything else, but he's not giving a discussion of Assyria, compatibilism, or anything else. He is talking on a very practical level to people who are trying to excuse their sin by blaming it on something other than their own lusts.
1 John 2:16 teaches us, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world."
Well, there's, a text that's not talking about the application being made unless you're trying to say world here is the world in opposition to God. And he's talking to Christians as to how Christians are to live. That's why he says anyone who loves the world, love of the Father does not dwell in him. So world for John, this is cosmos. And it evidently isn't the same world as John 3:16, is it? It's not every single human being. In fact, it's not human beings at all, really. It is that world system that stands in opposition to God, that is in rebellion against God, that is fallen. That's what it's talking about. In fact, I think that's coming up. Let's see if that might be the next one. It seems to be my recollection.
Calvinism claims all things are brought about by God's sovereign, meticulous decree. But the Scripture says that pride and lust are not from the Father, but from the world. From the website of the late R.C. Sproul, a prominent Calvinistic apologist, Ligonier Ministries writes, "God has planned or decreed all things, and thus they surely take place as he has planned, decreed, or ordained them." End quote.
Because they have filled this place with the blood of innocents, and have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I did not command or decree, nor did it come into my mind.
So
Now, there's no exegesis offered there. But let me roll it back here. Jeremiah chapter 19. This is one of the primary open theist proof texts. That's why I really think, if the Baptist Faith and Message didn't, that That's where Leighton would be, because that's where he wants to be. Because he keeps using stuff like this. So, which I did not command or decree, nor did it come into my mind. So, if you believe God has exhaustive knowledge of future events, this obviously isn't talking about that, is it? That's what the open theists say. See, it did not come into his mind. He did not know that there would be the offerings on the high places, or the offerings to Baal or Moloch or whatever the particular incidents might be. When God created, he didn't know it was going to happen. Because Leighton Flowers works for a Southern Baptist entity, he can't say that. So what does he got to do? Yes, he knew, but that actually arises from something outside of God. There is a secondary source for the existence of these things outside of God, and it's the libertarian free will of man. And so the command or decree is the eternal decree. Well, the problem with that is command. That's his law. God did not tell the people of Israel. He did not contain in his law commandments or decrees to offer their children in sacrifice. That's all it's saying. When it says it did not come into my mind, that's not saying God never thought about it, never knew it was going to happen. What he's saying is, this type of evil is so far removed from me and so far removed from my law that it is disgusting. And yet these people are claiming religious authority from me to do it. That's the consistent interpretation. That's the one that actually allows all of the scriptures to stand together. That's not really common for people to do that much anymore, but that's what it is. So why use open theist proof texts, I wonder? Well, you can decide for yourself.
Command or decree, nor did it come into my mind.
So Calvinism says God decreed all things. But God says, through the prophet Jeremiah, I did not command or decree that, nor did it enter into my mind.
Okay, absolutely false argument. Very shallow. This is common type of stuff. You look at the context, you realize what it's actually talking about. You can see the mixture of categories, this type of common error. We've been dealing with this for years, but this was only produced, I think, last week. Or within the past couple of days. I could go back and look at the date.
Demonstrating that God knows and uses evil intentions of men does not prove divine determinism, or what some call compatibilism. It only demonstrates his omniscience and his sovereign ability to bring about his purposes through the free choices of creatures.
And what is the ultimate authority for the provisionists? The free choices of creatures. And I have people who get angry at me because I say man-centeredness versus God-centeredness. It's right on the screen right in front of you. We just walked through it, played it, allowed you to see for yourself.